This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast.
I am a coal miner's daughter, proud as the mountain top pines, living in a body that has never been brought low by entering the mouth of a mine. I come from a long line of grunt men, true heirs to the kingdom of coal.
That was from All Those Days of Drinking Dust by Tiffany Williams from her album by the same name. She was an Eastern Kentucky girl, high school teacher in the coal fields. She left that job to devote her life to music. She moved to Nashville, and she's been just making great art since then. So she's got 3 albums. She's releasing a new song soon, and I will link her information in my show notes. And you're going to be hearing more music from Tiffany Williams throughout this episode. I really want to thank Tiffany for collaborating with me on this and lending her beautiful voice to this podcast.
I didn't know which God to pray to when the cave-in showed up on the evening news. Does the one above have jurisdiction where they go?
I'm so excited about this episode because this is the Barbara Kingsolver episode. It was an interview that took place on the campus of UVA Wise back in April. Barbara was here with Adriana Trigiani in Big Stone Gap, and then she came to Wise and she sat down with me, my colleague Brian McKnight, and a group of students to talk about Demon Copperhead, to talk about Appalachia, to talk about her writing process. In the evening, community members gathered and she talked to them, and it was the last time she said she was going to talk about Demon Copperhead, but she was happy to be bringing him back home. Now, Demon Copperhead is her Pulitzer Prize winning novel, and it is set in Lee County, Virginia, which is my native county, my home county. I was born and raised in Jonesville, which isn't far from where I live now, but that made it even more special for me. And you're going to hear her talk about why she set it in Lee County. You're going to hear her talk about how much she loves Lee County. It's a dark novel in some places, but it also has hope. It also has redemption. I'll be honest, I started reading it and I was just not in a mental space at the time to continue, so I paused and then I picked it back up. And when I picked it back up and started reading it, I quickly realized how brilliant Kingsolver is. I knew she was brilliant, but this is a novel that it's a love letter in a lot of ways to Appalachia. We have a child at the center, a child protagonist who she gives a voice, and that's Demon. And so there's so much to say about the book. I hope that you'll join me over on our Facebook community because I want to be talking about the book over there. I also hope you'll subscribe to either Patreon or Facebook where you can get bonus episodes. For subscribers, I'm going to share a bonus episode about her time spent in a band with Stephen King and Amy Tan and other writers. So that's a fun little story that I'll share for subscribers. They'll get early access to that. So let me introduce Barbara Kingsolver. Many years ago, I watched the Oprah Winfrey Show when it was on every day, and I especially loved following her book club. I remember the day when, on her show, she picked the Poisonwood Bible and introduced an author named Barbara Kingsolver. I learned that she was from Eastern Kentucky, and that blew my mind because there was an Appalachian on Oprah Winfrey. She was one of us. So it was appropriate that she came to UVA Wise because she has lived a life informed by a liberal arts education, which is what we have there. She's lived in the Appalachian Mountains, but she's also lived and worked in Europe, Africa, Asia, Mexico, South America, the Canary Islands. In college, she changed her major from piano to biology, and she took classes in creative writing, anthropology, history, French. She went to Greece. She did an internship with a pharmaceutical company. She kept journals fed by all of this, plus a post-college year traveling through Europe. She studied, get this, theoretical population genetics, but she was secretly writing poetry and fiction. She got a master's in biology, and though she kept her poetry and fiction a secret for many years, she never stopped writing. She never stopped learning, and as she says, quote, seeking a world beyond my small hometown and an uneasy status as an outsider in a peer group that valued conformity, end quote. She wrote all the way through 18 award-winning books of fiction, essays, and poetry, all the way to the Pulitzer Prize. Fast forward several books later, and there's Oprah again on my social media feed, choosing another Kingsolver book titled Demon Copperhead, which is a book set in my native Lee County, Virginia, against the backdrop of an opioid crisis and broken systems. It's a Dickens-inspired tale about, quote, all those born into beautiful cursed places they can't imagine leaving behind, end quote. It's also a book about resilience and hope and the powerful influence that teachers can have in the direction of a child's life. And it won the Pulitzer Prize, something that for a kid like Demon would feel unreachable. Upon winning the award, she said, I wrote this book for my people because we are so invisible to the rest of the world and so persistently misrepresented, and I couldn't be happier for this reason. So I'm proud to say that she is still one of us. She was named one of the most important writers of the 20th century by Writer's Digest, and I would say in the 21st century, she's still one of the most important. So welcome, Barbara Kingsolver.
I've been waiting my whole life to write this book in a certain way. I had to get this old, this much gray hair, and more importantly, be this comfortable with myself and my Appalachian identity to embrace this project of trying to, the way I was seeing it in my mind before I wrote it, and when it was scaring the tar out of me, was I wanted to write the great Appalachian novel, because I have spent my whole life, I grew up in Kentucky, thought Kentucky was a fine place to be from, then went to college in Indiana and discovered I was a hillbilly, and everybody thought that I was stupid and backward and bigoted, and oh, look, you're wearing shoes, and it's not funny, and it goes on. It didn't end there. And for my whole life, I have encountered stereotypes about Appalachia and almost never see us as we really are, for better and for worse, but the good stuff about us especially, but also the context of us and how come we have this kind of unemployment? How come we have these problems? What's the history? Who did this to us? That whole big thing I wanted to write, but I was scared to write it. And this voice in my head kept saying, nobody wants to read that, Barbara. Nobody wants to read that. Well, it took me a long time to understand that was all those people all my life saying, but you're ridiculous, and to just face that and do it was, I had to get to, and I'm going to break this to you. Life gets better. And one of the great things about getting older is you give less of a damn about what people think of you, and you can be yourself. So that's the project. That's what I wanted to do, to tell the story of us. I grew up in Kentucky. I now live in Washington County on a farm, not in Abingdon. I live in Meadowview, which is outside of, it's very rural. I'm a rural person. I'm an Appalachian. I've lived many other places in the world, but none of them was home. I had to come home. Wherever else I was homesick for these mountains. So where would I've written several books now set in Appalachia, and I have always set them in small towns that were like real small towns, but I gave them a fake name. I invented, like Zebulon Mountain and Egg Fork in Prodigal Summer is not a real town. It's like any number of towns around where we live, but I didn't want to pick a real place for several reasons. One is that Like if I said something in Meadowview, Virginia, it's such a tiny town. I mean, all of Meadowview would fit in this building. I don't want it to become like a destination where literary tourists come look at, I don't want to change the character of a place like that. So, and also I don't want the people who live there to be looking and saying, oh, that's me, or that's my cow, or that's my, that's my truck. I don't want people to be, like trying to identify themselves because they're not right. I don't put real people or trucks or real cows into my book. So this was different. I chose Lee County because my starting point for this novel I knew was going to be the opioid epidemic. Because the way I see it, the history of Appalachia is many things, but it's also a long history of outside corporations coming in to exploit the resources, to harvest something valuable from our place, take it out, and leave a mess. So first it was the timber, then it was the coal for more than a century. And coal mining really did a lot to the culture of education here. I mean, it wasn't good. It wasn't positive. A lot because the coal companies basically owned, these counties. They owned the courthouses. They owned the schools, the hospitals. They owned the stores. Some of them historically didn't even pay real money. They paid in scrip, which you had, like fake money that you had to take to their store and buy their stuff with their money. So the way I see it, and I wanted to put this all in a context in the story of a novel, and the way I see it is that the opioid epidemic is just the latest in, to use Demon's language, the latest car in the fuck train that has rolled over these mountains. It was just one more thing, one more corporate endeavor to harvest something, and in this case, they harvested our pain and left a mess. And in some ways, that was the most damaging mess of all, because addiction is the mess that they left behind. And addiction tears up community. It tears up families. I see you nodding. I don't know anybody around here whose family has not been touched by addiction. It tears holes in the stuff that that's most important to us, is our communities that we rely on. So that was my starting point. And Lee County was the starting point. Lee County was, we know now that Purdue Pharma was very deliberate about this, that they studied data. They looked at metrics, and they found 3 places in America that they knew were most vulnerable, where they could pump in this painkiller and make a fortune. And that had to do with very overstressed healthcare system, not enough doctors, people who didn't have the either the means or the time off work or the transportation to go back to their doctor for follow-up care. So doctors end up having to do a lot of prescription pad medicine. Instead of in a wealthier place or in a city, they could say, well, I'm going to refer you to a pain clinic or a yoga class or some other kind of thing, which we don't have here. What we have is pills. And they knew that, and they knew they could get us, and they did. And that made me so mad that Lee County seemed like a reasonable starting point. I've also been always fascinated by Lee County. I drive through it. My family is still in Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. So the way I go there is through the whole length, like from top to tail, that long drive that goes along you can see the ridge, and that's Kentucky up there, and then you go through the tunnel at Cumberland Gap, and you're in Kentucky. So I've made that drive so many times. I taught my daughters, both of them, to drive, to do interstate, like junior varsity interstate driving on that, on that divided highway, because there's almost never any cars on it, but it's like a divided highway. So I have and we always look for the bison, and there are amazing, beautiful places like the Sand Cave. That's amazing. And the Powell River, and my favorite oak tree in the world. You might know where it is. It's along that road. So it's a beautiful place. And it seemed like, in this case, I mean, I wouldn't have set the entire novel in Duffield or in Jonesville or, one of those towns, but to say, okay, Lee County is going to be our place, felt like my way of honoring Lee County, honestly. And so then I did more research. I mean, I did all kinds of research about into the foster care system, into addiction, but I also did place research. I made that hike to Devil's Bathtub in, okay, not high flood because I didn't want to do a reenactment, but enough flood. I took my dog and my dog wouldn't go. He said, no, that's too scary, Mama. So if you've ever been to Devil's Bathtub, you know the trail crosses the creek, I believe, 13 times before you get to the actual bathtub. So I had to do that in circumstances similar enough. And I went to football games. I'm not a sports fan, and I'm not a football fan. And so when my daughters found out that I was, okay, I have been to football games. In fact, this is kind of, my younger daughter went to UVA in Charlottesville. You know, you've heard of that one. So she was a Cavalier. She marched in the band. She was a marching Cavalier. And I would go to the football games to see their halftime shows, but I would arrange to get there like 1 minute before halftime, and then I'd leave right after. That's just me. So when my kids found out I was going to football games and staying the whole time, they said, "Oh man, Mom has been invaded by an alien." But the thing is, it was really important to this novel, the Friday Night Lights, the fact that everybody in town, like even in Meadowview, in our little high school, everybody in town goes to those football games, whether or not they have a kid on the field, whether or not they're related to anybody. They're up there saying, "Murder them! Kill Norton!" They're just screaming. People get so into it. That's a phenomenon. And that seemed to me a really important way when I knew what was going to happen. I don't want to ruin it for those of you who have yet to read it, but I knew Demon's path to OxyContin was going to be through sports, because that happens a lot because of the pressure on these guys, which are, these high school football players are children. They're children. Their bodies aren't done growing yet, and they have adult pressures on them to get back into the game and to play and hurt their bodies in permanent ways. And that's something that I wanted to explore, which is, again, a cultural thing that is related to, it all connects. The culture of Appalachia historically has not been kind to men and boys. The culture, the history, the sort of exploitive history of this place has treated men and boys as labor, as workhorses, rather than respecting and encouraging their minds. So this is all, see how it all connects together. This was the big, big picture I wanted to write about. So you can probably see that I've came over to Lee County a bunch of times. I still do. Why did I decide to adapt David Copperfield? I had been, as I mentioned, I was trying to find the doorway into this novel for 2 years. And I was very frustrated, and I was very afraid, and I just couldn't find my way in. I was working on other things, and it's pretty typical for me to have a novel on the back burner, kind of cooking, or like just mellow, just kind of cooking back there while I'm working on, the novel that's going to come next. But this one had been cooking, and I'd moved it to the front burner. It just still wasn't really going anywhere. And I was pretty worried about that. I knew I had wanted to write this novel. Maybe I just can't. And then I had a really weird experience where I was in London. I was finishing a book tour. I had finished a book tour from my previous book, and had a weekend to kill, and had I happened to, before my flight home, I had a weekend to just relax somewhere. And I saw on the internet that Charles Dickens's house, Bleak House, was like a bed and breakfast, and you could go there and like spend the night in Charles Dickens's house. And I thought, well, that sounds cool. I didn't think it would be anything more than just kind of a fun experience, or maybe it was really a musty, moldy place and it'd be horrible. I didn't know, but it seemed worth a shot. And my husband had flown over and joined me. So out we go, we get on the train and we go out to Broadstairs. It's on the coast, and it was November, and it was a dark and stormy night. really. And here's this house, and it's very bleak. It's this mansion, and it's kind of leaning over the cliff, over the sea. And we knocked on the door, and the door creaks open. It was so atmospheric. And there was just this one guy behind the desk who looked like Bob Cratchit. And it was just like there was nobody else there because nobody, turns out, goes out to this beach town in November. And this little woman who limped, literally she limped down the stairs and said, "May I take your luggage?" I said, "No, little Dorrit, I can do it myself." So they just said, "Well, make yourselves at home." And it was really spooky and cool and wild. And at the end of the hall and the upstairs, like on the second floor, was Charles Dickens' study where he wrote David Copperfield. And okay, in the US, this would be behind a velvet rope, right? There was no velvet rope. There was his desk. There was all this stuff, his manuscripts and stuff, just like this has been his house. And I guess it came down through the family, and they had all this Dickens stuff. And it was so clear that this is where he wrote David Copperfield, which was his favorite of his novels because it was his story, because he lived that hard life. His father went to debtor's prison. He had to go to work when he was when he was like 9 years old. He grew up with the shame of poverty and feeling like a thrown away kid. And he grew up really mad, and a lot of his writing, I believe, was driven by this outrage at the way people in polite Victorian society just looked away from poverty and from, especially kids, the kids who are the casualties of institutional poverty, because he was one of those kids. And this book was his story. And I was sitting in that room and just thinking about that. And I just felt like he's here and he's saying, you have to do this. And he said, I don't know where this came from, if it didn't come from Charles Dickens. He said, let the child tell the story. And I thought, okay, I'll let your kid tell the story. Right there and right then, I had the idea of writing my version of David Copperfield, because I thought this is a point worth making, that the societal problems of 170 years ago are still with us in terms of how society values kids, how society blames the victims of poverty. This is kind of like meta, right? This is kind of a point worth making. I thought it was a cool idea. I didn't know how well it would work to really lay my story directly over his, because I hadn't read David Copperfield for 10 or more years. I remembered the vague outlines, but not the specifics. So I went back to the Oliver Twist bedroom, and I got my notebook, and I went back and I opened it, and on that desk, and I started making notes. I started writing my own David Copperfield on his desk that night. And I knew I would call it Copperhead. And I knew my narrator would be this kid with red hair nicknamed Copperhead. On the flight home, I downloaded, because you can get anything. I downloaded David Copperfield and I read it beginning to end on the flight home, because, that's handy, like 9 hours where nobody's going to bother you. And I just was thinking, this is totally going to work. So I spent 3 years with David Copperfield right here at my elbow on my desk, open, just chapter by chapter. I put my plot right straight onto his plot. And so it was like puzzle solving, which I love puzzles. I love, Sudoku and, word games and all that. And this felt like a puzzle, like to take each situation, like what is the modern equivalent of a bootblack factory? I know, like kids sorting garbage behind the Circle K, which is also a meth lab. Just like one thing after another. What is the modern equivalent of this boys' school where these boys, of fairly poor families are just kind of thrown together without any kindness or instruction? Well, that would be a foster home. This Creaky farm, this old farmer they call Creaky, who really basically just takes in foster boys to use them as labor on his farm. So just piece by piece, I figured out my version of that story, but the plot was very serviceable and the characters were very serviceable. I just had to upgrade them and, find ways to make them relevant. And also my David Copperfield Demon. He's a lot more worldly. David Copperfield is like, oh, mommy has a new boyfriend. I hope he will be nice. And Demon is like, no way. No. So he's just more, because he's a modern kid. He's worldly. He's foul-mouthed. He drops the F-bomb a lot. But he has every reason to. He's mad. And I'm mad too on his behalf. And believe it or not, I dialed back his anger. And, I wrote many drafts. I always write a lot of drafts. I revise, every sentence that you read in that book has been rewritten between 7 and 27 times. So in the first version, believe it or not, he was a lot more mad than he is in the final version. He was very oppositional, and I realized, okay, I can't start that way. You can't hate it. You have to like him. So I kind of warmed you up to the kid, and then, once you're really on his side and you understand what a bad deal he's gotten, then you're mad with him, and it's okay for him to drop all the F-bombs. Hopefully you weren't offended by that. I don't talk that way, but my dad read the book and he said, nobody's going to read this language. I said, Dad, sorry.
Rubbing on his hands and knees. All those days of drinking dust. All those nights of feeling like he couldn't breathe. I'd give a different life to us.
Believe it or not, it came pretty naturally. Well, I love Appalachian language. It's so poetic. I think that it's influenced by the King James Bible and, Scots Irish. And we have all these expressions and ways of talking that are uniquely Appalachian, and which probably if you came here from somewhere else, probably confused you when people say, I wouldn't care to do that. They mean they want to do it. They don't mean I wouldn't care to do that. Other people think that means I don't want to do it, but it means you do want to do it. We say whenever, always, whenever I went to the store this morning. We say that's happened on accident. These are not mistakes. This is our language. And I spent a lot of years trying to erase that language from my tongue because people made fun of it. And it felt like, I don't know, I felt as happy as a pig rolling in mud to just get in there and really embrace the language of my childhood and my teenage years and really use all those expressions. And so that came naturally to me. And I wanted, that's a craft issue. And it takes, it doesn't just flow. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of sort of pondering each sentence and how to construct it. But I wanted to make him sound Appalachian without using what I call Uncle Remus language, where you misspell words, like you say, you write doing and going and leave off the G's to make it, so the reader hears. I don't want to do that because that's condescending. That suggests that this is substandard language. It's not. Our language is real and valuable. It's not substandard, no matter what you've heard and what I've heard all my life. So that was a great pleasure to me to really dig in and think about all the things that I used to hear my mama say, I'll snatch you bald-headed, or, ugly as a mudstick fence, or, just those things that are in my ear from childhood, or there she goes parading herself around. It was such a pleasure to just use that and embrace it without shame. His anger, his frustration. I remember what it was like to be a teenager. I was a teenager. I remember it perfectly. I remember being a teenager much better than I remember being 30, honestly, because everything was so intense, right? The first everything, you're the humiliations are you think you're going to die from them. And the little happiness is when somebody that you have a crush on looks at you, oh my God, you think you're going to die from that too. Everything is so intense. So I just, I just tapped into that and enjoyed it. That's the main thing, is I just love what I do. I'm the luckiest person to get up and just go to my desk and tell stories for a living. So just to get in there and really use that voice that I guess I've been like choking back for decades, it just felt great. It felt great to be unapologetic in his voice. And yes, F-bombs. But that's how kids talk. That's real. And the people who ban books and the parents who try to keep books like this away from their kids because they think that those kids will become something else because they've heard this language or because they are, they have seen that people use drugs. I feel sorry for those parents. They have no idea. They aren't really talking to their kids. I learned about sex on the bus from seeing it when I was in third grade. I mean, really? Yeah, the bus. And that little red-haired girl that cracks the Etch-a-Sketch over the guy's head and all the silver stuff comes down and he looks like the Tin Man. I saw that. On my own bus when I was, in third grade. And I was like, go, Tammy. He so deserved that. What does Demon say? She's going to be president of something someday.
To the north and south that ain't cursed, where a man can walk upright and get ahead. These are the only ones that watched us rot and rot and hold the bones of both our living and our dead. All those years grubbing on his hands and knees, all those days of drinking dust, all those nights of feeling like he couldn't breathe. I'd give a different life to us.
Okay, first of all, my starting point, again, we can thank Mr. Dickens because the trajectory of David Copperfield is that this young boy becomes a famous writer. He becomes Charles Dickens. So in the course of the novel, you see him, becoming writing stories and starting to have some success as a writer. Well, I thought, okay, I love that idea that art can be can be a tool and a wonderful sort of emotional tool for processing trauma and sort of staying engaged with life. I love that idea. But my kid in Lee County is not going to become a famous writer. Even though I did, but okay, that was, I didn't want to do that. I thought, and so then I found in David Copperfield, right on the very first page, he writes, or Dickens wrote, had David Copperfield say, whether I am to be the hero of my own life or whether someone else will play that role remains to be seen. I saw that word hero and that was the key. I thought superheroes, kids, little boys love superheroes, Marvel, DC, and just the appeal of that, especially for a kid who has no power over anything, to imagine a world of superpowers where someone could come in and save the day. And then, he develops that. And so I liked giving him that talent, making him an artist, and a comic artist seemed appropriate to his age and his time and his milieu. And I had to educate myself. I was never all that into comics, so now I know a lot about comics. But that's another thing. You should see I always have a shelf of books that are my, in my office, like the books that I'm reading when I am working on a novel, and that book has got so many comic books in it. It's full of Marvel and DC comics, other comics. And this was one of my favorite questions because I've done a whole lot of talking about this book. And one of my favorite questions came from a high school student who said, I am here representing my comic club. And he said, first, we wonder how you know about Vandal Savage. Because that's pretty arcane. Yes, even an old lady with gray hair can know about Vandal Savage. Mr. Dickens decided that for me. He wrote the first draft, and once I decided to follow the plot of David Copperfield, that was decided. But of course, I wanted him to be okay. First of all, he's telling you the story. He has to be alive at the end, right? And that's kind of a promise. That's a favor I give the reader when in his worst moments when you're thinking, oh God, now what? And will he get out of this? You remember, he's telling the story. He's going to be here at the end. So this is a survivor's journey. It's a hero's journey. And I liked that structure. And when I read David Copperfield, I thought, the women characters really needed work. Mr. Dickens did not know as much about being a woman as I do. I'll just say that. So I felt like I had a lot of room for improvement on the characters like Agnes, who became my Angus. She's one of my favorite characters in the book. And Mrs. Peggott and Aunt June. There really wasn't an Aunt June. She was just part of the Peggotty clan, I guess. But the thing is, the structure, the plot, the narrative was perfect. I thought, I can't improve on this. I will do what I need to do to make it my story and make it a Lee County story. But as far as where everybody ends up, it was perfect. No, not quite perfect. He added an extra chapter, like an epilogue at the end, where David Copperfield and his beloved have 5 children rolling on the floor, and they're saying, "Oh, life is so wonderful." And I thought, we don't need that. Out. No, done. But everything else pretty much. And there were a few blind alleys that I just left alone because, believe it or not, this book, it's a long book. I thank you for reading all the pages, or that you're going to read all the pages. But the first draft when I finished it, the first draft was 750 pages long. So I'm not going to do that to you. That's way too long. So, and I think David Copperfield was much longer book. With every successive draft, I set myself, among many goals, a specific goal of removing 10% of the page count every time. So I just kept doing that until it got down to the length that it is. And at that point, because I didn't do that by dropping whole chapters. I did that by really compressing every scene and every sentence, leaving out the adverbs. If there are 2 adjectives, pick one, jettison the other. Just making every sentence and every scene as tight as it could be. And that's one of the many ways that you apply your craft and make your work better. It's really so much about what you throw out as much as what you keep. I think he was a very functional kid, honestly. He got his mother to work. He was running his household basically by the time he was 4 or 5 years old. So, I don't think a kid who genuinely has ADHD he'd be playing with his Legos, or he'd be running around and his mom wouldn't get to work, So I think that kids in his situation, kids who have endured a lot of trauma, in my experience from, knowing and watching and seeing and talking to professionals, kids who have that kind of trauma in their background often act out in various ways, or they're oppositional, or they can express, difficult behaviors because they're damaged. They're dealing with damage. But in the school system, they often get diagnoses of convenience just so, somebody thinks, well, get some Ritalin in this kid, or it's the easy answer. And it's sometimes the necessary, because just like the doctors don't have time enough with each patient to really, address the pain, neither do the teachers. They are overwhelmed because we don't have enough resources in our school systems. So I think this kid had, like many kids, had heard a lot of diagnoses, and he didn't really understand many of them. And a scene that I really like is when he talks for the first time with Mr. Armstrong, the counselor, who's really the first adult to really see him in the school setting. And Mr. Armstrong reads all of his thick files of everything he's been through in the foster care system and stuff. And so Mr. Armstrong says, well, I can tell you one thing I know about you. You are resilient. And Demon says, are you going to give me drugs for that? He thinks it's another diagnosis because that's just all he's ever heard is what's wrong with him. Well, see, I think that's wonderful because I just gave you my opinion of this kid, but I want you it could be. I mean, it could be that his brain works a lot of the ways like you do, and it could be that his trauma and the things, like we know now, trauma changes brains and it changes our thought, our cognitive processes and stuff. So you were seeing things in him that resonated with you, and I love that. And I think that every reader, my hope is that every reader finds in the novel ways that they relate to Demon and ways that they, care about his situation, and that can sort of bring more compassion to the situation of kids like him. Demon is exactly the same age as one of my kids. So I'm very familiar with the music, the members only jackets, like the things that kids wore and said and did in the 90s. And I also had my kids, she's my older daughter. My other daughter is almost 10 years younger. I had my kids vet this for, authenticity of language, and they were very helpful there. But, you have to do all kinds of research to write a novel. I had to do a lot of research on sort of the life of what it's like to live in active addiction, because I'm very happy and lucky to say I haven't lived that life, and I haven't lived directly with that life. So I spent a lot of hours just sitting with people who are in active addiction, or more often who have come through that and are in recovery and have, some perspective on it, but who could just tell me all the things that they've, like how hard that life is, how it's not enviable, how very often it begins with a sports injury and a bottle of pills, a legal prescription from a doctor who says, take every one of these, don't miss a pill, stay ahead of the pain. And then by the time you get to the end of the bottle, you're addicted already. I am friends with Dr. Van Zee in Lee County, who sees a lot of his whole practice now is treating people in recovery. And he was the one who connected me with patients who would talk about their experience. And he was the first whistleblower. He was one of the first medical professionals, in the whole country to see what was going on, And he said a lot of his patients, and these, it's not kids seeking a high, it's mothers and fathers and uncles. And he said a lot of people didn't even know they were addicted. They just came back and said, I need more of these pills, doc, because when I stopped taking them, I felt like I was going to die. They didn't even know they were dope sick. It's maddening that people in ignorance just dismiss addicted people as bad, people who need to be put in jail. This is a wonderful thing about what I get to do with my life, is to write books that I feel like can bring new truths to people, so that they can to help them understand the world in a different way. So you probably figured this out. I love my job. I really like writing books. So hearing those stories, and just even things like, chasing the dragon, like I didn't know the specifics of, here's a pill, how do you get that pill into your veins? What are the steps? And it's stuff that I had to learn. And it was hard, of course, emotional work to sit with people and hear, the awfulest things that they've been through. But I also found that in every case, people that I found who came to me, to talk to me, were very glad to be listened to, and glad that the lost years of their lives could be put to use for some purpose. And that purpose, I believe, is to try to create more compassion among people who haven't known the disease of addiction, to see it as a disease that nobody wants. It's not something that bad people do. It's not a criminal thing. It's a disease that can only be cured with medicine and love, compassion. So I think that everybody that helped me with this project, was a part of that. And it was a beautiful thing to kind of pull together that community. Every time, you write a novel, you have to learn so many things. You have to become an expert in something new. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, because you have to be as smart as everybody at least as smart as everybody in your novel. You can't say, well, like, then the physicist said something really smart about physics. You have to know what he said, and why. So you have to do a lot of research, and then you rely on people to vet for you and make sure that you got it right. But see, I love that. When I was in college, I felt so lucky to be there. Like, jackpot, I get to do this. Hardly anybody from my high school got to go to college. So I felt like I'd won the lottery to be there. And every class I took, I thought, this is amazing. I wanted to major in everything. So I found the right job.